Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe on the YouTube channel. Alan MacLeod joins us today, and we discuss the recent UK elections and how the Labour Party's Brexit strategy backfired. We talk about the relentless propaganda campaign that was launched against Jeremy Corbyn and how there's a similar campaign being run against Bernie Sanders in the United States that's growing in intensity. We wonder if Bernie's going to learn from Corbyn's experience or whether he'll continue the kind of high road approach that did not turn out well for Corbyn. We also discuss the post-election implications for the future of the United Kingdom and its constituent countries, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And lastly, we discuss the coup in Bolivia. Dr. Alan MacLeod is an academic, an author, and a journalist who does work on media analysis and politics with a focus on social media, Latin American politics, and propaganda. He works for Mint Press News, Fairness, Inaccuracy, and Reporting, and he's written 2 recent books. Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting, and Propaganda in the Information Age, Still Manufacturing Consent. We recorded this on December 19th, 2019. Alan MacLeod joins us today from Edinburgh in Scotland. Welcome back to Around the Empire, Alan. It's great to hear from you.
Yeah, good to be with you again.
So I've got 3 of your recent articles here that you wrote on the UK election and how the Brexit strategy backfired. People can find these links in the show notes, and they're all from Mint Press News, for whom you're writing a lot now, right?
Yeah, I'm now a staff writer there, so I'm writing there 6-7 times a week.
Wow, but I noticed that you're putting out a lot of material. I don't know how you guys do it. But so there's 3 articles, and the first one is titled Labour's Brexit Strategy Backfires as UK Votes to Leave the EU at Any Cost. The second one is about Jeremy Corbyn stepping down after the election catastrophe. And the third one is about how the weapons manufacturers and banks, their share prices skyrocketed immediately after Boris Johnson won. So, I guess let's start with the first one. Let me see if I have any broader questions we want to talk about first. I'm really curious about this question. Did a lot of Blairites lose their seats?
A lot of people did lose their seats, yeah. Blairites and left-wingers aplenty. Labour's red wall, as we call it, the large swath of red over the north of the country, which is kind of analogous to the US Rust Belt, so this post-industrial northern part of the UK, saw huge losses for Labour, and they were particularly in Leave voting seats. So we saw almost 100% of the constituencies lost by Labour were in Leave voting seats, whereas the seats that generally voted for Remain did a little bit better. Labour still lost a fair amount of votes there, but it was really in the Brexit areas that the places were lost.
And in the Brexit areas, I don't know if there is a firm definition of whether an MP is a Blairite or not, but in the Brexit areas, did they tend to be Corbyn supporters or Blair supporters or something in between or neither?
Well, in general, the Parliamentary Labour Party, that means the quite high-level bureaucrats or the members of Parliament, generally they have been working their way up the party in the last 20, 30 years when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown were the heads of the Labour Party. And what that meant was they really pushed the party to the right and abandoned their social democratic or even socialist models that they had in the mid-20th century and embraced a neoliberal style of politics, not unlike what's happened with the Democratic Party with, say, Bill Clinton in the 90s.
Right.
So Tony Blair was really our kind of Bill Clinton. So that means we've got this weird situation where Jeremy Corbyn was overwhelmingly voted for by the rank and file membership of Labour, and yet the people in positions of power absolutely hated him, and they've spent the last 4 years trying to overthrow him in a series of parliamentary or, in sort of intra-party coups. And so, yes, there have been an awful lot of Blairites losing their seats.
Yeah, and you're right. There is a big parallel here, and I've mentioned before that in the past, I guess when I first started learning about UK politics, I really couldn't draw many parallels. It didn't look very similar to me. But now that has changed a lot. I see a lot of similarities and unfortunate similarities. But the other thing you mentioned, of course, Brexit is undoubtedly a big factor in this loss. Gordon Dimmock and I had talked about this, and thought he said that Corbyn was gaining some momentum. The polls were showing that he was gaining momentum. That did not come out, obviously, in these election results. But the other thing that you mentioned, and it can't be ignored, although Brexit was a huge thing, is the propaganda campaign that was run against Corbyn. And of course, we have been seeing that kind of thing against Bernie Sanders and now against Tulsi Gabbard for years now. So we're not surprised by that. But maybe the scale of it and the effect that it apparently had. And since this is one of your expert on this topic, do you want to talk a little bit about that propaganda campaign that was run against Corbyn? And especially just before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about sort of like the long-term effects of, like, you wonder, why do they keep this up even when most people don't believe it? But if they just hammer it and hammer it and hammer these points of negativity. And I'll leave it to you to explain the mechanisms of that, if you would.
Sure. So, I mean, our media system is quite a lot like the US's in that it is highly concentrated in just a few hands. Many of them are the same people. Rupert Murdoch, for instance, is one of the biggest players in the UK media here. We do have a nationalised broadcaster, the BBC, which plays an important role. But what we've seen is they have very much followed the lead and even been the spearhead in the campaign against Corbyn. And it really has been amazing to watch over the past 4 years how a vegetarian, pacifist, anti-racist activist, completely calm, very affable man, an old guy that you might see in, an English church committee or an Amnesty International club who was making the tea for people, a gardener. He's been turned into this figure of absolute hate, a terrorist, an IRA sympathizer, a threat to national security, and the number one that has been going around is that he is an anti-Semite, which seems to be based on absolutely nothing. And yet, if we do have a look at the media databases, they'll show that there's been around 4,500 different articles between September 2015, when Corbyn was elected leader of the Labour Party, to April 2019. And in the last 3 months, we've seen 1,445 articles in national newspapers alone claiming that Corbyn is an anti-Semite. So this constant barrage of negative publicity, whether that's he didn't sing the national anthem loud enough, or he didn't bow deeply enough at a Remembrance Sunday parade, these sorts of things just seep into the national consciousness. And when you talk to low information voters on the doorstep, they'll say, well, I do like Labour's policies, or my family used to be Labour supporters, but the problem is Corbyn because he's an anti-Semite or he's something. And you ask them why, and then they don't really have an answer for that. But the answer is basically being this relentless, hostile environment that has been created for the Labour leader. If I was Corbyn's advisor, which I'm not, I would have said that he should go out of this really, really hard and use Britain's very stringent and draconian libel laws to sue these media companies for defamation. However, Corbyn is almost the definition of a very nice gentleman. He absolutely refuses to sling mud whenever it happens. People say that when people ask him about this, he says, I will always remain high. I will never stoop to that sort of ability, that level. Unfortunately, it seems that his own friendliness and his own integrity has really cost him in this election. One thing I would say is that watching this, media have already learned a great deal and are starting to put in place the same sort of tactics that they used against Corbyn, against Sanders. So we've seen in the last week or so, we have seen a flurry of articles in mainstream US publications claiming that while Bernie Sanders is Jewish, his campaign is the most anti-Semitic in decades. And of course, what that really means is opposition to the government of Israel or opposition to wars and capitalism more generally. But I would just say to an American audience, watch out for those articles because they're going to start coming thick and fast.
Yeah, and I don't recall which batch of emails it was in, but in some of the emails that WikiLeaks released in 2016, there was talk in the Clinton campaign about trying to use an anti-Semitism charge against him or to try and use his religion against him, but they didn't go for that then. But I'm not so sure that this is campaign oriented. Now, forgive me for not having read more deeply into this, but I saw some headlines and tweets about how the people who were engaging in these information operations against Corbyn were actually military and intelligence funded or military intelligence, you know, active members of the UK government military intelligence. Is that true, or did I read some stuff that wasn't really reliable?
No, you're right. The military has played its part. In fact, almost as soon as Corbyn was elected, a senior member of the military, I believe he was a general, essentially said that there would be a coup if Corbyn was ever elected prime minister. We've seen members of the security services say that Corbyn is a national security threat. The former head of MI5, Stella Remington, said that. So we have seen a state-led campaign against the leader of the opposition to try to prevent him coming to power. I would say that if people are shocked by this has a very long history in the United Kingdom. In fact, that was the genesis of the BBC. So in 1926, Britain had what they call a general strike, the Great Strike of 1926, which came reasonably close to actually pushing through a socialist revolution on the lines of the one that happened in the USSR 9 years earlier. The BBC was lended to the government to try to break this strike, and Lord Weath, who was the Director General, said that he had been really the absolute crux of how the government managed to defend itself in the head of the strike. In fact, he said that if Louis XVI hadn't had a national broadcaster, there'd have been no French Revolution. And the BBC reported on the happy escape the nation had from a Labour-led government. So this has really been going on for nearly 100 years in the UK.
Wow. That's yeah, that's depressing. However, I don't know, you could look at it as in terms of their effectiveness over that period of time, they haven't been completely successful either. So I don't know, maybe there's hope. One other huge topic that didn't seem to play a big role in this election, which surprised me, was the documents that leaked about privatizing Britain's National Health Service. And we can see that Labour, relied on this issue strongly. They kind of banked on it, it looks like to me. But it looks like that people didn't believe them, it didn't come through. For some reason, Boris was almost single issue, get Brexit done was his campaign, plus a lot of weird marketing in his ads, like that series of tweets from the movie Love Actually, imitating the movie. Just kind of, it was odd to see his advertising people what they did. But Corbyn seemed to try to focus on the National Health Service, which, from everything I know, is a real risk, a serious risk, but either it wasn't taken seriously or people thought Brexit was more important. Is there any, I mean, it'll take time to understand that one, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, a study from First Draft News just came out showing that 88% of the Tories' Facebook ads were actually either misleading or perhaps even worse. You're right that Corbyn was leaked a load of documents which did show that the Conservatives were in negotiations with the Trump administration to privatise the National Health Service. Um, One Tory minister confirmed that the documents were real, but we really have to rely on the mainstream media as a medium to actually get this message out of just Downing Street and into the living rooms of the UK public. And that's really the problem here, because what happened was the story got transmutated very quickly into these documents were leaked by the Russians. And suddenly the story became, is Corbyn leading? Is he some sort of like Russian asset here? Why did he get leaked Russian documents? Now, that claim seems quite dubious to me, but the fact that it was repeated over and over had the desired effect. I mean, the NHS is so popular in the UK. In fact, polls show that people would countenance privatizing the military before the hospitals, and yet it certainly is on the table. And unfortunately, the Conservatives were able to kind of deflect attention away from that. And if you actually look at the polling data, which asks why did certain people vote for certain parties, you can see that 41% of Tory voters said that the NHS was one of their top priorities, which is really astonishing considering that they are low-key under the table trying to privatise it. If you look at the polls, you'll see, like just in the United States, just like in the US, older voters tend to vote more right-wing. The Conservatives pulled in 62% of the retired vote, for instance, in this election. And yet it really does seem like it's like turkeys voting for Christmas, as the elderly seem to be getting rid of the health service, which is sustaining their lives.
Yeah. So they basically believed, I guess Theresa May claimed on the floor of the House of Commons, that the NHS is not for sale. And if that soundbite just got played over and over again, it's just that, and this is the way the conservative parties have worked to undermine the very few kind of sparse social programs that we have. And they don't come out, well, I mean, some of them do come out right out against it and try to take it down. But in general, the successful strategy has been to, over decades, just chip away at these things. But in this case, they actually, yeah, I mean, that's crazy. It's a top priority for everyone across the spectrum. And yet, they didn't heed any of the warnings that Corbyn was putting out.
Yeah, well, I mean, she did say the NHS is not for sale, but the reality is that it has been for sale for a number of decades now, and that did not just start with the Conservatives. Tony Blair had the great idea of privatizing the building of hospitals, things that we're still paying for now. And even though that the Conservatives can say that they've spent more money on the healthcare system than any other government, that's really not good enough. When you actually look at what they're spending it on, that really becomes the problem when you're seeing they're giving king's ransoms to management consultants, enormous amounts of money to private healthcare companies to deliver services that used to be nationalized. So I think when we look at just the amount being spent, that's not good enough, because the quality of care is certainly dropping. If you talk to any healthcare professional in the UK, you'll hear a story of them being overworked, underpaid, and understaffed, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's one of the ways to undermine it. Now, the third article about the weapons manufacturers and the banks being very happy about Boris's election. You analyze some of the spikes in the share price of some of the top British weapons manufacturers, some of which I'm not familiar with. You mentioned Babcock, BAE Systems, Cobham, Serco, Kinetic, Chemring, and Ultra Electronics. And then you show that the major banks, too, were celebrating.
Yeah, that's right. So there was a story that I saw that said that the stock market had increased on the news of the Boris Johnson victory. And I just thought, well, what companies are interested in it? I wonder if it's the defense contractors. And lo and behold, not 8 out of the 9 largest UK defense contractors had in fact seen their stock prices rise. Some of them incredibly. You'd seen rises of 10% in an hour, for instance. Most of the UK weapons manufacturers or arms manufacturers are perhaps not as well known as the American ones like Colt or McDonnell and Douglas or something like that. Mostly because Britain tends to concentrate on providing avionics and the computers and the software behind missiles or jet planes, for instance. And so they're not quite as overtly military as something like Boeing, for instance. But nevertheless, the UK has a very large arms sector, and 49% of all our sales go to Saudi Arabia. And it's pretty clear what's going on with Saudi Arabia weapons right now. They're getting used on the Yemeni population in what is the most pressing humanitarian crisis in the world just now, according to the UN. So we see that perhaps about 23 million people are in desperate need of humanitarian assistance in Yemen. There are millions of undernourished people, including children. Millions of people have been driven from their homes. And this is being funded and aided by the Conservative government in the UK. Corbyn said that he would immediately stop arms sales to Saudi Arabia if he was elected. That would obviously have a huge impact on these weapons manufacturers. As I said, half of their profits come from selling things to the Saudis. And so with the news of the Conservative victory, their share prices spiked, as did the banks, who Corbyn has always made a lot of critical remarks about. There was a lot of speculation that they might regulate or even nationalise a lot of the banks. But Lloyds TSB, for example, one of the largest banks in the UK, their share price went up by 20% in an hour after the first hour after Johnson was declared the Prime Minister. And their share price has basically remained at that level since.
Now, one more big question in my mind. If you would, just the UK is made up of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. And if you could just, and there were a lot of messages sent in the politics in this election of those areas too. Can you just summarize like sort of the political dynamics in particularly Scotland and Northern Ireland? And, are we looking at a breakup of the UK kingdom, possibly a reunion of Ireland, Scotland becoming independent? I'm not sure. I don't know that much about Wales, but what did we see in this election?
Yeah, well, I actually wrote about this subject in the American Herald Tribune. What we saw in Scotland was a overwhelming victory for the Scottish National Party, who are associated with one thing and one thing only, which is independence for Scotland. So the SNP won 40-something% of the vote, which translated into about 85% of the seats in Scotland. That adds to the majority they have in the local Scottish Parliament, which is quite an impressive achievement because we have a proportional representation, multi-party democracy in Scotland. Our politics are very different to England. We have a much more left-wing, left-leaning consensus. Even the Conservative Party is way to the left of what it is in England. And yes, opinion polls show that a majority of people now support Scottish independence. We had a referendum 5 years ago where 45% of the country voted to leave the UK. Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister of Scotland, has already said that she's going to very likely hold another referendum in 2020. And as I said, the bookmakers are showing that it's probably more likely than not right now, in a way, that the population will vote for independence. It's quite ironic, actually, because the full title of the Conservative Party is the Conservative and Unionist Party. And Boris Johnson always talks about himself as a one-nation conservative. But the ironic thing is that he might be ruling over a much smaller nation in the years to come. It's the same thing in Northern Ireland, where for the first time we have a majority backing Irish reunification. The leader of the right-wing Protestant Democratic Unionist Party lost his seat to a Sinn Féin member. Now, Sinn Féin are the political wing of the IRA, and we saw them make huge strides in the Northern Irish elections there. So if you look at one of these polling maps, you'll see that the north is really covered in dark green, and that's from Sinn Féin's impressive victory over the past few weeks. So we may see a coming breakup of the UK. That would be the worst case scenario for Johnson, but frankly, the best case scenario is that he managed to somehow hold this coalition together, but it certainly feels like the momentum is going one way.
The Conservatives needed the Unionists in Northern Ireland to create Theresa May's coalition, right?
Yeah, that's right. The DUP are this right-wing Protestant faction from Northern Ireland who were called upon to be part of the coalition so that Theresa May could govern. They are far to the right of the Conservative Party. They don't really, for instance, they still don't officially accept that dinosaurs were real, to give you a sort of extent of what their politics might be around. Yeah, but the problem is that bringing them into government in Westminster pretty much formally made the Conservative Party in contempt of court, if you will, over the Good Friday Agreements, which ended the Northern Irish Civil War and the British occupation. And so lots of people have speculated that there might be a return to some kind of, if not open civil war like we had in the 20th century, maybe increased confrontations between left and right, Catholic and Protestant.
Now, can Scotland and Northern Ireland can they launch a referendum on their own? Can they decide for themselves if they're going to break off from the United Kingdom?
Officially, no, and that's the real sticking point right now. So Johnson has already said that he likely won't accept any kind of new referendum. However, Nicola Sturgeon is playing this one very bullishly. She has a huge mandate for a new referendum. Everybody knows what voting for the Scottish National Party means. And when you win 80-something% of the seats in your country, I think that really shows what could happen. Now, we might get a situation like we had in Catalonia a couple of years ago, where the local government calls a wildcat referendum, and who knows what could happen. I mean, it seems crazy to me to say that the First Minister could get arrested by the government in London, but I'm sure people in Barcelona would have said the same thing a few years ago, that it would be crazy that Madrid would send troops into Catalonia to quell rebellions and get the police out into the streets, crack heads, and put out arrest warrants for presidents of a whole region. But, we've seen it in Spain, so I don't know. I don't really see why it couldn't happen in Scotland either.
So you could be in for some interesting times, huh, Alan?
Yeah, that's one thing about living in the UK right now. We certainly do live in interesting times.
So also, people should check out, Alan's been following, he follows Latin American politics all the time, but lately he's been doing a lot of work on Bolivia, and it's not fair to ask you to give us a bit of an update in a few minutes, but I think I might try to ask you to do that if you would.
Yeah, no worries. So I suppose it starts with Evo Morales winning another election in October 20th. He won by around 10.5%, which meant that he didn't even need to go to a runoff election. However, the opposition cried foul, and that cry of fraud was echoed by the OAS. And over the next few weeks, we saw the military and the police rebel and insist that Morales step down. They led a campaign of violence against his ruling MAS party, the Movement to Socialism, and Morales eventually fled to Mexico, and now he's in Argentina. Since then, the military handpicked Janine Áñez, who is a strongly conservative, revanchist right-winger. Her party only got 4% at the election, but that can probably be explained because she has a lot of white nationalist tendencies or overtly anti-Indigenous policies, which is a problem if the country is up to 85% Indigenous, as some surveys show Bolivia is. She, for
Wow, I didn't
instance,
know it was that high.
yeah, well, it depends how you would classify Indigenous. So perhaps pure Indigenous people probably make up 50% of the population, but then the percentage that actually are half Indigenous or some sort of mixture is probably 30-40% as well. So we've got a traditional white elite now ruling Bolivia. Áñez pre-exonerated all the military and the police of any crimes they commit and putting down the resistance to her rule, which is plentiful. We see entire regions of the country, particularly the west of the country, the highlands, where most of the indigenous people live, or at least it's most heavily populated by indigenous people. Those are in pretty much open rebellion, and the government is not in control right now. But the government has conducted a number of massacres, for instance, at Sencata, just outside El Alto, and there was one just outside Cochabamba as well. So we've seen dozens of people killed, hundreds more injured, and thousands have been arrested, including journalists. Some journalists have been shot. We've even seen one journalist from Argentina killed, but that hasn't been picked up anywhere in the Western media as far as I'm aware. So in general, we've seen that the United States has totally green-lighted this, as has the mainstream media. But journalists from inside the ground are reporting that there is still huge opposition to Áñez's regime. It does seem like a classic case of a right-wing coup in Latin America, bringing about a far-right government like we saw in the 20th century. In fact, Evo Morales, the ousted president, was just interviewed by Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept, and he said that this was Operation Condor 2.0. He was referencing the 20th century plans of Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, which overthrew so many democratically elected leaders in the region and replaced them with fascist military dictatorships.
I didn't get to check that interview out yet. I will. We're kind of overwhelmed here with information and news. It's crazy, but I definitely want to get to that one. So, and so they put out an arrest warrant for him now, and
Yeah,
he's still in Mexico.
he's now gone to Argentina, which is another
Oh,
friendly country. The Argentinian president, a center leftist, invited him to come and see his inauguration, and I think he stayed there for a week now. But the new Bolivian government really is it's just comically it's like comically evil in a lot of ways. You know, the president calls indigenous people satanic. The information minister says that we're having a crackdown on any seditious media. Arturo Murillo, the interior minister, proudly stands in front of a load of masked, armed death squads saying that these are for foreign journalists who come here and commit terrorism. It really is astonishing how brazen they are, that they say the quiet part loud like Donald Trump is, and they're not really able to keep some of their more extremist tendencies under wrap.
okay. Well, I hate to wrap it up on such a down note there, but I need to let you go. Anything else that you want to talk about, please do that. And also, please let our listeners know where to find your work and your books and how to support you.
Oh yeah, sure. So it's probably easiest to find me on Twitter at Alan R. MacLeod. That's AlanRMacleod. I'm mostly writing about Latin America just now. Also write at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. As I said, you can find me at Mint Press News as well, where I'm a staff writer. I write about 6 articles or so a week there. Yeah, 2 books I wrote about. One was the media coverage of Venezuela called Bad News from Venezuela. And I've also written an updated version of Manufacturing Consent. So it's really written with the internet age in mind and the age of social media. How does that really change how we see the media? And the answer is basically not very much. Just because we get things on social media or online doesn't really change the fact that these companies we're getting them from are still owned and controlled by extremely wealthy individuals.
Right. And I do want to, we did do an episode, which I'll also link in the show notes, where we talked about bad news in Venezuela, at least in part, not the whole book, but some of it. And I do want to talk to you about your latest book as soon as I can pull that together. But thank you so much for giving us your time and your knowledge, and I really appreciate it. And, best wishes to you and your family over the holidays, and maybe a more peaceful New Year, although it's not looking good, but we have to keep trying.
Yeah, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to everyone listening too.
Okay, take care, Alan.
See you.
Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Alan MacLeod. Follow him on Twitter at Alan R. MacLeod, Alan R. MacLeod. Find his work at Mint Press News and look for his books, Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting, and his latest book, Propaganda in the Information Age, Still Manufacturing Consent. Around the Empire podcast, independent media. Your support is really important. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. You can find this podcast in many places, and there are a lot of ways to listen to it. You can find it on any mobile podcast app, on the website aroundtheempire.com, on Patreon, and on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. If you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to hit the like, share, and subscribe. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.